On a cold, windswept morning in December 1903, two brothers from Dayton, Ohio, achieved what humanity had only dreamed of for centuries. In the pale light of dawn on the dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, a fragile biplane known as the Wright Flyer lifted from its wooden rail into the air. Wilbur Wright jogged alongside as Orville Wright lay prone at the controls, the Flyer's small engine roaring against the coastal gusts. For 12 brief seconds, the machine stayed aloft, wobbling above the sand and surf for a distance of just 120 feet before touching down. It wasn't a long flight, barely the length of a wingspan off the ground, but it was long enough. In that gentle, fleeting ascent, the world entered the age of flight, and life on Earth would never be the same. Dawn at Kitty Hawk, 1903, a gentle beginning. The Wright brothers' first flight on December 17th, 1903, was a humble and quiet triumph witnessed by only 5 local observers. The morning air was cold and calm, with low clouds drifting over the desolate sand hills of Kill Devil Hills. The Atlantic breeze, steady at over 20 miles per hour, provided the lift they needed. The brothers had failed in an attempt 3 days earlier, damaging their flyer in the process, but they painstakingly repaired it and waited for the right conditions. Now, with the flyer positioned on its launching rail and the wind properly aligned, they were ready. "Off we go," Orville might have whispered under his breath as he released the restraining wire. The small propellers bit into the damp air, and the biplane slid forward, gathering speed on the monorail track until, to the astonishment of the spectators, it rose into the air. It was a delicate, trembling ascent. The canvas wings rattled, and the rudders strained as Orville made subtle adjustments to keep balance using their ingenious wing-warping control system. A local life-saving station worker snapped a now-famous photograph just at the moment the flyer left the ground. In the image, the spindly craft hangs a few feet above the sand, with Wilbur running alongside, arms outstretched as if ready to catch the machine should it falter. In that singular frame, the world's first powered, controlled flight is frozen in time, a tenuous miracle against a gray winter sky. Orville's first flight was only the beginning. The brothers alternated turns, coaxing a little more distance out of each attempt. By the 4th flight, around midday, Wilbur stayed aloft for 59 seconds, covering 852 feet, before a gust of wind brought the flyer gently back to Earth. This was the real thing, an observer would later remark, as the final flight demonstrated a level of control and duration that transcended any brief hop. The Wrights were ecstatic yet cautious. They knew the significance of their success, but on that day there were no cheering crowds or global headlines, only the sound of the wind and the whoops of two brothers on an empty beach. They telegraphed their father with modest words, "Success, inform press, home for Christmas." In the moment, the achievement felt personal and profound, a dream realized in solitude. The modern aviation age was quietly born. As the sun set on Kitty Hawk, the flyer lay overturned and damaged by a sudden gust after the last landing, never to fly again. Yet Orville and Wilbur stood by it with a sense of calm fulfillment. They knew they had done something that would reverberate far beyond these remote dunes. Not in 1,000 years would man fly, skeptics had said, but here, on this silent stretch of sand, that skepticism had been proven wrong in the span of a single morning. In the glow of that achievement, the Wright brothers packed up their broken plane and their precious notebooks. They headed home for Christmas with wind-burned faces and a secret that the world was only beginning to discover. Human flight was possible. After Kitty Hawk, skepticism, and the first fledgling flights, 1903, 1908, incredibly, the world met the Wrights' triumph with a collective shrug at first. News of the Kitty Hawk flights spread slowly and was often greeted with disbelief. Years of exaggerated or false claims by others had bred cynicism. Many assumed this was yet another impossible boast. Even the Wrights' hometown newspaper, the Dayton Journal, declined to print the story, dismissing the 12-second flight as too short to matter. An editorial in 1906 grumbled, "The Wrights have flown, or they have not flown. They are in fact either flyers or liars." Such was the mood of the time. Flying was still considered a fool's errand by much of the public and press. Pessimism reigned supreme. Only a handful of curious engineers and enthusiasts took notice of the brothers' claims. Part of the skepticism was the Wrights' own doing. They were intensely protective of their invention, shying away from public demonstrations until they could secure patents and contracts. After Kitty Hawk, they continued their experiments in near secrecy on a cow pasture called Hoofman Prairie outside Dayton. Throughout 1904 and 1905, they methodically improved their flyer, teaching themselves how to make controlled turns, bank in figure eights, and stay aloft for up to 20-30 minutes at a time. Farmers and local onlookers saw mysterious glimpses of a flying machine circling above the fields, but newspapers remained doubtful. When the Wrights did invite reporters to a trial in 1904, the result was disappointing. Mechanical problems on that day allowed only a brief, sputtering hop. The press left unconvinced, writing off the Wrights as dreamers who had nothing solid to show. Meanwhile, failures elsewhere had primed the public to doubt. Prestigious experimenters like Samuel Langley, backed by the Smithsonian Institution, had famously attempted a powered flight in late 1903, only to have his machine dramatically crash into the Potomac River. Other well-funded efforts by inventors such as Clément Ader in France and Hiram Maxim in England had also ended in failure or farce. How could two unknown bicycle mechanics succeed where eminent scientists had not? Frankly, none of us believed it, recalled James Cox, a Dayton editor, about the early claims of the Wrights. In the public imagination, human flight was still a wild fantasy. Some newspapers even declared it would take 1 million to 10 million years for flying machines to evolve, scoffing at any nearer possibility. The Wrights, it seemed, were ahead of their time, and few were ready to give them credit. Yet the years immediately after 1903 saw a quiet flowering of progress. In their Ohio pasture, the brothers were effectively teaching the world how to fly, even if the world didn't know it yet. By October 1905, Wilbur piloted their improved Flyer 3s for 39 minutes, circling Huffman Prairie and covering 24 miles in one sustained flight. It was a stunning achievement. They had transformed the airplane from a fragile novelty into a practical aerial vehicle. Still, they told almost no one. They sent letters to the U.S. government and potential investors, offering a flying machine that could revolutionize transportation or warfare. But these offers were met with polite skepticism or outright dismissal. A Wright airplane had never been seen by any official beyond their small circle. In an age before viral videos and instant communication, seeing was believing, and few had seen a Wright flyer in action. That changed in 1908, the year the airplane truly went public. Tired of being doubted and eager to secure deals, the Wrights finally agreed to give public demonstration flights, Wilbur in France and Orville in the United States. On August 8, 1908, at a horse racing field near Le Mans, France, Wilbur Wright climbed into the seat of a Wright flyer before a crowd of skeptical French aviators and journalists. What followed left the onlookers astounded. Wilbur banked the plane smoothly into turns, made figure-8 circuits above the grassy field, and kept the airplane under precise control for minute after minute. The doubters were silenced in an instant. Ils ont volé. They have flown, cried one French reporter, unable to contain his excitement. In a matter of days, Wilbur became a celebrity in France, acclaimed for bringing to life the long-sought dream of flight. Not even the birds fly around as beautifully as Mr. Wright, marveled spectators at Le Mans, who suddenly understood that a new epoch had begun. Orville, meanwhile, demonstrated another flyer to the U.S. Army at Fort Myer, Virginia, that fall. On September 9, 1908, he flew for over an hour, circling above the parade grounds as awestruck military officers and Washington officials watched in disbelief. The Washington Times proclaimed, "World's airship, record smashed," and quoted an eyewitness exclaiming, "I would rather be Orville Wright right now than the President of the United States." Public skepticism melted into amazement. After nearly 5 years of being ignored, the Wright brothers at last received their due fame. They secured a contract to sell airplanes to the U.S. Signal Corps and started a successful aviation company. The age of practical flight had arrived, and the world quickly pivoted from disbelief to a fervent enthusiasm for the new miracle of the skies. Yet in these early years, the mood was still one of cautious wonder. Crowds by the thousands would gather to see a man fly in those days, gasping at each precarious turn and gentle landing. The Wrights and their peers were venturing into the unknown, and every flight felt like a fragile defiance of nature's laws. When Orville and Wilbur banked their aircraft against a breeze or glided silently down to earth, spectators described a kind of poetry in the motion. A French poet watching Wilbur's displays in 1908 wrote that the airplane moved in a grace that is not of this world, calling it poetry of steel in the sky. The early flyers, not just the Wrights, but a growing handful of pioneers worldwide, were becoming symbols of human daring and ingenuity. And as the reality of flight sank in, humanity's imagination took wing. A reporter in 1908 reflected on what he had seen at Fort Myer, musing that these airplanes were only 5 years removed from Kitty Hawk, yet already they whisper of future journeys across continents and oceans. The world was waking up to a new horizon of possibilities that extended far beyond that lonely beach, where the first tentative flight had begun. Pioneers of the sky, from America to Europe and beyond, 1904, 1914, as the Wright brothers honed their craft in semi-secrecy, other daring pioneers around the globe were also taking to the air. In the years after 1903, A veritable dawn chorus of aviation experiments arose in Europe, South America, and elsewhere, often independently and with little knowledge of each other's progress. It was as if the idea of flight, long a universal human aspiration, had finally found its moment, inspiring inventors everywhere to slip the surly bonds of Earth, each in their own way. One of the most celebrated early flyers was Alberto Santos Dumont, a Brazilian living in Paris. Santos Dumont had already made a name for himself flying graceful dirigible airships around the Eiffel Tower in the early 1900s, enchanting Parisians with his airborne excursions. But after hearing rumors of the Wright's success, Santos Dumont turned his inventive mind to heavier-than-air machines. On October 23, 1906, in the crisp autumn air at Paris's Bagatelle Field, he piloted a curious contraption called the 14 Billes, essentially a kite-like biplane with boxy wings, and managed a flight of about 60 meters, 197 feet, before a crowd of astonished onlookers. A few weeks later, in November 1906, he flew the 14 Bis again, this time covering 220 meters, 720 feet, in 21 seconds. These were the first public airplane flights in Europe, and they electrified the continent. The press hailed Santos Dumont as the conqueror of the air. Some Europeans even claimed he, not the Wrights, deserved recognition as first in flight, since the Wright's 1903 feat had not been publicly verified. In truth, Santos Dumont's flights were less controlled than the Wright's earlier work. His aircraft could mostly manage straight hops, but they proved that the airplane was now a worldwide phenomenon. Crowds in Paris cheered this stylish Brazilian inventor who would land his flying machine and then jauntily motor off in his little automobile, his scarf trailing behind. The age of the aviator hero was dawning. Europe's fertile ground yielded more pioneers in rapid succession. In 1907, the charismatic Romanian-born engineer Traian Vuia and French inventor Louis Blériot were experimenting with monoplanes, single-wing aircraft that looked quite different from the Wright's biplanes. Vuia managed a short hop in his own powered airplane as early as March 1906 in France, though it barely lifted off. Blériot, a relentless tinkerer, built a series of sleek monoplanes and endured many crashes and broken bones in the process of learning to fly. By 1908, Blériot had a reliable machine, the Blériot Inbine, and became one of Europe's most skilled pilots. He famously demonstrated the robustness of his aircraft by crossing the English Channel on July 25, 1909, flying from Calais to Dover in just 37 minutes. That flight made Blériot an international celebrity overnight. The image of his little plane emerging from the morning mist to land on English soil, proving that a flimsy airplane could traverse the sea between nations, captured the world's imagination. No longer was flight confined to exhibition fields. It was now a means of going places, of connecting distant shores. The channel crossing also had a strategic subtext. If an airplane could cross from France to England, it implied that oceans and borders might no longer be impenetrable barriers in war or peace. By the 1910s, nearly every industrialized nation had a cadre of enthusiasts building and flying early aircraft. In the United States, innovators like Glenn Curtiss emerged as rivals to the Wrights. Curtiss, a skilled motorcycle engineer, joined early air meets and stunned spectators with his speed. He won a race at the 1909 Reims Air Meet in France, and soon was setting records in America. The Wrights and Curtiss engaged in a famous rivalry, including patent lawsuits over control mechanisms, but together they spurred the rapid advancement of American aviation. Curtiss designed the first practical seaplane in 1911, allowing takeoff from water, and trained many early pilots. His contributions would lay groundwork for naval aviation and broader aircraft designs. Across the Atlantic, France was unquestionably the cradle of early aviation culture. The late 1900s saw feverish activity. Designers like Henri Farman, a British-born French aviator, built biplanes that could carry a passenger. Farman's flights in 1908-09 demonstrated steadier control and earned him records for endurance. By 1910, Europe had organized numerous air races and exhibitions. Crowds in the tens of thousands flocked to see the flying machines at events like the 1910 Paris Air Show or the circuits of European capitals. Aviation's first superstars emerged. Men like Hubert Latham, Adolphe Pégu, and Louis-Paul Hahn, who traveled city to city performing daring flights and competing for prizes. Pégu in 1913 became one of the first to intentionally loop the loop in an airplane, turning a terrifying prospect into a show-stopping stunt and earning the title of the world's first aerobat. The word airman entered common usage, and newspapers breathlessly covered each new speed or altitude record broken. Public enthusiasm was further amplified by the inclusion of women and international figures in these exploits. In an era where many opportunities were denied to women, a few bold individuals claimed their place in the sky. Elise Desroches, known as Baroness Raymonde de la Roche, became the world's first licensed female pilot in 1910, thrilling onlookers with her solo flights around France. Harriet Quimby in the United States earned her pilot's license in 1911, and a year later stunned observers by flying across the English Channel, the first woman to do so, dressed in a purple satin flying suit. Although Quimby's career was tragically cut short in a crash, she had become an icon, proving that aviation's lure knew no gender. Bessie Coleman, the first African American and Native American female pilot, had to go all the way to France to earn her license in 1921, slightly later in our story. But even in the 1910s, the seeds of wider inclusion were sown by the pioneering women who refused to be left on the ground. Their courage gave society new heroines to celebrate and challenged stereotypes, all while maintaining that calm, confident demeanor aviators were coming to be known for. In these years before the First World War, almost every month brought a new first or record in aviation. First flights in new countries were milestones of national pride. An Australian, Colin de Vries, attempted the continent's first hop in late 1909. In Japan, Captain Yoshitoshi Tokugawa made the archipelago's first official powered flight in 1910. By 1911, Italy had used a primitive airplane in warfare during the Italo-Turkish War in North Africa. Lieutenant Giulio Gavotti dropped a hand grenade from his flimsy aircraft on Turkish positions, marking the first aerial bombing in history, a small bomb that caused little damage, but a portent of things to come. That same year, the United States set up its first military aviation unit, and in 1914, the world's first scheduled commercial airline service briefly took wing in Florida. More on that soon. It seemed as if human flight was spreading everywhere, a contagion of innovation and daring. For the general public, these pioneers were sources of awe and inspiration. Many people still had never seen an airplane in person, so when an exhibition came to town, It was a momentous occasion. Air meets were grand festivals. At the Los Angeles Air Meet in January 1910, for example, some 250,000 spectators, an enormous crowd for the time, gathered over 10 days to watch aircraft soar like giant birds above Dominguez Field. Newspapers recount how onlookers gasped when pilots like Curtis or Lincoln Beechey, another American daredevil, performed dives and spirals. The novelty of seeing a machine leave Earth's surface and move freely in 3 dimensions touched something almost spiritual in audiences. A wonderful thing happened, wrote journalist Richard Harding Davis after experiencing a flight in 1911. As the plane lifted, he watched the world below shrink to toy-like proportions. The high board fence and the tops of the highest pine trees suddenly sank beneath us. The roads became ribbons, and the houses a white ball on a green billiard cloth. Davis admitted that before takeoff he was terrified, as many first-time flyers were, but in the air he felt an epiphany. What lures them is the call of a new world, detachment from everything humdrum. He explained of the aviators, the exhilaration that makes every other sensation stale. Such testimonials, printed in popular magazines, spread the gospel of flight far and wide. The world on the eve of 1914 was enchanted by aviation. In little more than a decade since Kitty Hawk, the airplane had gone from a rumor to a reality, from a sputtering kite to a growing fleet of practical vehicles. Yet as much as these early years brought excitement and admiration, they also carried undertones of foreboding. The same newspapers that celebrated record flights also carried somber reports when exhibitions went wrong. Fatalities of early pilots were all too common, and each crash was a reminder of the risks in this new endeavor. Flight was still fragile. One poignant example occurred in 1908 during Orville Wright's demonstration for the U.S. Army at Fort Myer. His plane suffered a propeller failure and crashed, injuring Orville and killing his passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, the first fatality in a powered airplane. The incident shocked people and underscored that the conquest of the air had come at a cost. Selfridge's death and others in those pioneer days were mourned as martyrs of progress, often with a kind of reverence. These pilots were modern Icaruses, flying close to the sun of possibility. Unlike the ancient Icarus, they were inching humanity forward, but sometimes at the expense of their own lives. And so, as 1914 dawned, humanity had learned to fly, but was still learning how to do so safely and wisely. No one could have imagined how soon the airplane's dual nature, as both a wondrous vehicle and a potential weapon, would be put to the ultimate test. The era of peaceful exhibition and friendly competition was about to give way to something far more serious, as the world's great powers prepared to harness this young invention for the coming storm of war. Wings of war. Aviation in World War I's and 1916. When World War I erupted in August 1914, the airplane was barely a decade old, still a rickety open-framed contraption of wood, wire, and canvas. Many military leaders were unsure what to do with it. Some high-ranking officers initially saw aircraft as mere novelties or scouting tools at best. Yet within a few short years, the crucible of the Great War would transform aviation beyond all recognition. By the war's end in 1918, the skies above the trenches had become a crucial new front, and the airplane had evolved from a timid fledgling to a fearsome eagle. At the start of the war, the role of aircraft was indeed reconnaissance. Observation balloons had been used in 19th century wars, but free-flying airplanes now offered a dynamic way to scout enemy movements from above. Pilots and observers, often carrying maps and cameras, would venture over enemy lines, peering down at troop convoys, railroads, and fortifications. In the early weeks of combat, these eyes in the sky proved their value. Famously, in August 1914, a French pilot spotted the wheeling movement of the German First Army during the Battle of the Marne. This vital information helped the Allies anticipate and halt the German advance on Paris. For perhaps the first time in history, a battle's outcome was influenced by an airplane's view. Skeptical generals began to realize that while cavalry scouts could be stopped by barbed wire and machine guns, an airplane could soar above the fray and reveal the hidden face of the battlefield. It did not take long for each side to try to deny this advantage to the enemy. What began as pilots merely waving or shaking fists at each other in midair quickly escalated. They started carrying pistols and rifles aloft, taking potshots at rival observers. By 1915, airplanes were mounted with machine guns, and the era of the fighter plane was born. A key innovation, the machine gun synchronization gear, pioneered by French and German engineers, allowed a forward-firing gun to shoot through a whirling propeller without striking its blades. This development turned fast, single-seater aircraft into deadly pursuit planes that could hunt the enemy in the clouds. Aerial duels began to play out in the sky above the static trench lines, capturing the public's imagination and spawning the legend of the flying ace. These aces, young men in their flying machines, were portrayed as modern-day knights jousting in the heavens. In a war known for its brutal mud and impersonal slaughter on the ground, the air war had a strangely romantic sheen, at least in the popular press. The top pilots, who downed enemy planes in significant numbers, became household names. Manfred von Richthofen, the German pilot better known as the Red Baron, painted his Fokker triplane a vivid red and achieved 80 aerial victories before being killed in action. His chivalrous image, a nobleman dueling at dawn, was embellished by propaganda, even as he and his comrades were essentially refined predators of the sky. On the Allied side, France celebrated aces like Georges Guynemer and René Fonck. Britain had Edward McManus and James McCudden, and the United States, entering the war in 1917, produced heroes like Eddie Rickenbacker, a former race car driver who tallied 26 victories. These pilots often wrote memoirs or were lionized in newspapers, describing the eerie beauty of sunrise patrols over the front, the tension of stalking an opponent through clouds, and the tragic camaraderie of seeing friends fall in flames. They were the knights of the air, and while their exploits provided a needed morale boost to war-weary nations, the reality was far less glamorous. Most combat pilots' lifespans were desperately short, measured in weeks after arriving at the front, and the air war was as lethal and unforgiving as any trench charge. As the war ground on, aviation's role rapidly expanded. Aircraft were developed for specialized tasks. Besides fighters and reconnaissance craft, there were now bombers, larger aircraft with multiple engines capable of carrying bombs to drop on enemy lines or even cities. In the early years, bombing was primitive and not very effective, Pilots or observers would literally toss small handheld bombs overboard or use crude bomb sites. Yet by 1917-1918, strategic bombing raids were being launched. Giant German Zeppelins, slow-moving airships, carried out some of the first bombing raids on London in 1915, terrorizing civilians from the night sky. These were followed by the Gotha and Handley Page heavy bomber airplanes that could fly across the English Channel under cover of darkness. The results, in terms of damage, were limited compared to the massive bombings of the next World War, but they sowed fear and pointed to the future, demonstrating that war was no longer confined to the front lines. The British people, gazing up at buzzing specks high above, experienced the unsettling new reality that nowhere, not even the home front, was truly safe from the reach of air power. On the battlefield itself, planes became essential tools. They directed artillery fire via wireless telegraphy. Observer planes would spot the fall of shells and radio back adjustments, making artillery far more accurate. Some aircraft were outfitted as ground attack planes, trench strafers, swooping low to strafe enemy trenches with machine guns or drop small bombs in support of infantry. The German Junkers J.I., an armored all-metal aircraft, and the British Sopwith Camel, modified with bombs, were early examples of close air support. In a sense, the airplane had extended warfare into the vertical dimension, adding a new layer to the conflict that generals had to consider. The sky was now a battlefield strewn with clouds of witnesses, as one poet aviator put it, witness to both the bravery and the horror unfolding below. Technologically, World War I was a ferocious accelerator for aviation. Pre-war aircraft were frail and underpowered. By 1918, designs had advanced dramatically in speed, range, and durability. Consider that in 1914, an average aircraft like the French Blériot or early Morane Saulnier might fly 60-70 miles and barely climb to 3,000 feet. By 1918, fighters like the French Spad-3s or the British Sopwith Dolphin had top speeds around 130-140 miles and could reach altitudes above 18,000 feet. Engineers learned to incorporate powerful rotary and inline engines, strengthen airframes, and streamline designs for better aerodynamics. The Fokker D-7, a late-war German fighter, was so advanced and effective in dogfights that the Armistice Agreement specifically demanded all Fokker D-7s be surrendered to the Allies. The war spurred not only incremental improvements, but also breakthroughs. The first practical seaplanes and flying boats emerged, used in anti-submarine patrols over the ocean, and by 1918, both the Allies and Central Powers had experimented with carrier-based aviation. Britain's HMS Furious launched a Sopwith Camel attack on Zeppelin hangars in 1918, a precursor to modern aircraft carriers. Perhaps the most remarkable leap was the arrival of the first jets, not in combat, but in concept. In Germany, pioneering engineers like Hans von Ohain, and in Britain Frank Whittle, were conceptualizing jet propulsion before the end of the 1930s. But even in WWI, the seeds were planted as inventors sought higher speeds. The actual first jet flight would come in WOs, but it's intriguing how the relentless push for performance began in the Great War. By the war's end in November 1918, aviation had gone from an auxiliary sideshow to a core element of warfare. The major combatants had created air arms, Britain's Royal Flying Corps and Royal Naval Air Service, which merged in 1918 to form the world's first independent air force, the Royal Air Force, RAF. Germany's air service, Luftstreitkräfte, and France's Aéronautique Militaire had grown exponentially. The United States, late to the war, trained thousands of pilots in a crash program and sent over units equipped mostly with French-built planes. A whole generation of young men had become pilots, mechanics, and aircraft designers, forging an aerial expertise that would not disappear in peacetime. And tens of thousands of aircraft had been built. Britain and France each produced on the order of 50,000, 70,000 planes during the war, and Germany around 48,000, while the U.S. industry was just ramping up when the war ended. The skies over the Western Front had at times swarmed with aircraft. During critical battles in 1918, hundreds of Allied and German planes might be in the air simultaneously, engaging in dogfights or swarming over trenches, a sight unimaginable just 4 years earlier. For those who lived through it, the transformation was astounding. Soldiers in 1914 who had never seen an airplane would, by 1918, routinely look up to see formations of friendly or enemy aircraft leaving white traceries across the sky. Civilians in cities learned to respond to air raid sirens and take shelter from distant thunder of aerial bombardment. And the pilots, those who survived, often described a sense of having inhabited a different realm, a place of solitude and immense perspective high above the earth. Many struggled to convey the beauty of what they saw up there amid the carnage. It was during WWI that the famous poem High Flight was composed by John Gillespie Magee Jr., an Allied pilot, technically in W.O. Litzwer's, but reflecting a sentiment shared by earlier flyers. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. The poem's joyous reverence for flight, written in wartime, encapsulates the ambivalence of the aviator's experience, in love with the air even as war raged beneath. When the guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, the world was exhausted and shattered. Yet from the wreckage, the airplane emerged as a symbol of modernity and future hope. It had proven its worth and potential under the worst circumstances. Now, as peace dawned, many asked, what would these flying machines do in peacetime? Could the energy and innovation that had been devoted to building better ways to destroy also be harnessed to build better ways to connect and heal? The 1920s would attempt to answer that question as barnstormers, male pilots, and visionary entrepreneurs took the advances of wartime and turned them toward the pursuits of peace, and sometimes just the pure joy of flying. Roaring skies, barnstormers, airmail, and the birth of commercial airlines. 1918, 1929. In the wake of World War I, a surplus of airplanes and trained pilots suddenly existed, and the world was eager to see what they would do next. With peace at hand, many military aviators found themselves grounded, but not for long. The 1920s sky exploded with activity, this time in the civilian realm. Daredevil barnstormers toured the countryside, airmail routes spanned continents, and nascent airlines began carrying paying passengers. It was as if aviation, unchained from military duty, had burst into a carnival of innovation and showmanship. Barnstorming, taking flight to the masses. Perhaps nothing captured the freewheeling spirit of the 1920s in aviation more than barnstorming. Barnstormers were former military pilots and some self-taught civilians who took advantage of cheap, surplus warplanes flooding the market. The U.S. government, sold off hundreds of Curtiss JN-4 Jenny biplanes, the very trainers used to teach American pilots, for as little as $200 each, machines that had cost about $5,000 to build during the war. Suddenly, anyone with a bit of money and flying skill could own an airplane. And so they did. In the early 1920s, dozens, then hundreds of pilots hopped into these Jennies and hit the open skies in search of fame, fortune, or at least a bit of gas money. Barnstormers would fly from town to town, often literally landing in a farmer's field, unannounced, to the astonishment of rural onlookers. They'd hop out, toss their leather cap on, and offer airplane rides for a few dollars, or stage impromptu flying exhibitions. Many Americans, and people in other countries as well, saw their very first airplane up close, thanks to these wandering aerial showmen. The term barnstorming itself comes from the notion of storming into a farm's barnyard or field to put on a show. With no federal regulations at first, and no established airfields in most places, any open pasture could become an impromptu airport. What those shows entailed was nothing short of daredevil entertainment. Pilots performed loops, barrel rolls, and steep dives, showing off maneuvers that had been honed in combat, but now elicited gasps and cheers from spectators below. They would cut their engines to simulate a dead-stick free fall and then restart just before crash, or fly low to snatch handkerchiefs off the ground with their wingtip, anything to wow the crowd. Soon, an entire cast of stunt performers joined the act. Wing walkers like the famous Gladys Ingle would climb out and stroll on the upper wing of a plane in mid-flight, or leap from plane to plane. Parachutists would jump off at altitude and float down in front of wide-eyed children. One pioneer, Ormer Locklear, became famous for changing planes mid-air and even for transferring from a moving car to a plane via a rope ladder. Unfortunately, he died performing a stunt for a film in 1920, highlighting the mortal risks these acts carried. Barnstorming teams formed into flying circuses, such as the Gates Flying Circus, which at its peak attracted tens of thousands of spectators to a single show. Pilots with names like Tex Rankin or Spid Holman became folk heroes of the sky. For the audiences, barnstormers delivered pure delight and inspiration. Here were these men and women, seemingly ordinary folks, doing the impossible, dancing in the sky, and living to tell the tale. Many a child in a small Midwestern or prairie town saw a barnstormer's tricks and thereafter nursed their own dream of flying. Notable future aviators got their start this way. A young Charles Lindbergh first learned to fly in 1922 as a barnstormer's apprentice, performing wing walking and parachute jumps before he ever piloted, and then barnstorming himself across the South and Midwest in a Jenny. Even in Europe, where fewer war surplus planes were available, stunt pilots and flying displays became common at fairs and expositions. Yet barnstorming could not last forever. The very chaos and risk that made it thrilling also ensured its days were numbered. By the mid-1920s, a string of accidents, sometimes involving innocent spectators, and a recognition of the need for safety brought on the first civil aviation regulations. In the U.S., laws were passed requiring pilot licenses, safety inspections, and prohibiting the most dangerous stunts over populated areas. Gradually, the anything-goes era of barnstorming gave way to more structured air shows and commercially oriented flying. But its impact was indelible. Barnstormers had introduced aviation to the masses in an intimate, visceral way. They took flying from the pages of newspapers and set it down in people's backyards, letting aspiring flyers touch the fabric wings, hear the sputter of the engine, and even go up for a spin over their own hometown. This did more to normalize and popularize the idea of flying than perhaps any government program could have. A whole generation in the 1920s got to experience the new wonder of flight up close, building public support that would fuel the growth of commercial aviation. The airmail revolution. While barnstormers were looping the loop for thrills, another group of pilots in the 1920s were flying for a different purpose, carrying the mail. It was not as glamorous a calling, perhaps, but it would prove vitally important in shaping the future of aviation. The idea was simple: use airplanes to deliver mail faster than trains. But implementing it was an epic saga of perseverance, technological challenge, and heroism. The United States led the way in establishing scheduled airmail service. The first tentative airmail flights began during WWI. In May 1918, Army pilots flew mail between Washington, D.C., and New York City via Philadelphia. The Post Office Department soon took over, determined to make airmail permanent. By 1920, they had opened a transcontinental route from New York to San Francisco. However, the planes of the time, largely war surplus de Havilland DH-4 biplanes, were underpowered, and the pilots flew by instinct and dead reckoning, often following railroad tracks to navigate. Worse, there was no provision for night flying initially. Come dusk, the mail had to be offloaded to trains because pilots feared getting lost or crashing in the dark. It took a daring experiment to change that. In February 1921, a pilot named Jack Knight became a national hero when he volunteered for an emergency test of all-night flying. A winter storm had delayed mail in the Midwest, and to avoid a backlog, the post office attempted a continuous relay of flights through the night. Knight flew through pitch-black skies from North Platte, Nebraska, all the way to Chicago, guided by bonfires lit by farmers along the route. Fighting fatigue and using whatever landmarks he could discern in the feeble moonlight, Knight landed safely in Chicago at dawn, having proven that night airmail was feasible. This feat captured headlines. The image of a lone biplane braving the dark skies to deliver the mail suggested a new kind of fearless, selfless aviator in service of the public. Following Knight's success, the post office moved quickly to establish a lighted airway. By 1923-1924, a string of rotating beacons on 50-foot towers were erected every 15 to 25 miles along the transcontinental airmail route from New York to San Francisco. These powerful electric beacons, visible up to 30 miles away, flashed coded signals to identify each waypoint. Intermediate emergency landing fields were created, each marked with boundary lights and equipped with personnel to assist any downed pilot. In essence, the post office built the world's first air traffic control network on the ground, long before radar or satellite navigation. On July 1st, 1924, for the first time, mail planes flew day and night coast to coast, cutting the mail delivery time from coast to coast to as little as 34 hours, down from multiple days by train. Letters posted in New York could realistically reach California in 2 days, a speed unheard of at the time. This had tangible economic effects as it accelerated the clearing of checks and financial transactions across the country. The airmail pilots quickly gained a reputation for grit and endurance. Flying in open cockpits through rain, snow, and fog with minimal instruments, they often relied on intuition and bravery. Many perished in crashes due to weather or mechanical failure. But their ranks also produced some legendary figures and advances. Pilots like Dean Smith and L. Ray Jeppesen, who later founded the Aeronautical Chart Company, pioneered navigation techniques. By flying at night, they learned the tricks of orienting by stars and eventually trusting new tools like the artificial horizon and turn and bank indicators. The quote from pilot Dean Smith in 1924 sums up the mix of fear and accomplishment. It felt empty and lonesome out there, even with the beacons flashing. We felt the fear of the unknown, the excitement of pioneering, and the satisfaction of the accomplishment. Reveals the inner life of those early airmen. Alone, with the hum of their engine and the flicker of beacon lights below, they were like trailblazers crossing a dark frontier, forging pathways in the sky. The success of the airmail service had a profound catalytic effect on commercial aviation. It established regular routes and spurred the improvement of aircraft. To meet the demands of mail delivery, better planes were developed, sturdier, with more reliable engines. The post office itself experimented with new designs, and when private manufacturers saw the potential, they started building advanced models. In 1925, the U.S. Congress passed the Kelly Act, Airmail Act, which allowed private companies to bid on mail routes, effectively jump-starting the commercial airline industry. Suddenly, a host of small startup airlines emerged, eager to win mail contracts. Companies that would later become famous airlines, such as Boeing Air Transport, predecessor of United Airlines, Transcontinental Air Transport, which became TWA, and Eastern Airlines, were born in this period, essentially subsidized by mail revenue. The U.S. government, by offloading mail flying to the private sector and then enacting the Air Commerce Act of 1926 to regulate safety and licensing, set the stage for a competitive, innovative airline industry. This was a stark contrast to Europe, where governments often directly supported national airlines with subsidies, but sometimes stifled competition and innovation. The American approach fostered a vibrant environment where carriers vied to carry mail and a few passengers, pushing plane manufacturers to supply faster and larger aircraft to outdo rivals. The birth of commercial airlines. As the 1920s progressed, carrying the mail alone was not enough. Airlines began to see the potential of carrying passengers. Initially, people were wary. Early passenger flight was costly and frankly uncomfortable and risky. But improvements in technology and a bit of adventurous glamour gradually lured paying customers into the skies. In truth, commercial flight-carrying passengers had existed in seed form even before WWI. A notable early example is often cited. On January 1st, 1914, the St. Petersburg-Tampa airboat line in Florida began the world's first scheduled airline service using a small Benoist 14 flying boat. Pilot Tony Janis flew one paying passenger across Tampa Bay, a trip of about 21 miles that took 23 minutes. That service lasted only a few months, as a sort of novelty and local booster project, but it proved the concept people would indeed pay to save time by flying. Percy Fansler, the airline's founder, prophetically said at the onset, "What was impossible yesterday is an accomplishment of today, while tomorrow heralds the unbelievable." Those words would ring true in the coming decades. After WWI, the first major passenger carriers emerged in Europe. In 1919, just months after the war, two of the world's oldest airlines were founded, KLM Royal Dutch Airlines in the Netherlands and Avianca in Colombia, founded by German Colombian interests. That same year in Germany, De Lag, which had actually operated Zeppelin airship passenger flights pre-war, resumed some operations. In 1920, Qantas was established in Australia, and in 1923, Czech Airlines was born. These were initially small-scale operations, often government-backed, focusing on mail and a handful of brave passengers. Planes like converted war surplus bombers or new designs such as the British Airco DH B-16 could carry 4 to 6 passengers in very cramped quarters. One of the first sustained passenger routes was between London and Paris, started by Handley Page Transport and Farman Airlines in 1919. Such flights were adventurous, open cockpit or minimally enclosed biplanes, flying relatively low to avoid the extreme cold of higher altitudes, since cabins were unheated and unpressurized, subject to every bump of turbulence. Passengers in the 1920s typically wore heavy coats, sometimes goggles, and were given cotton to stuff in their ears against the engine noise. It was said that flying in a multi-stop flight from Paris to Rome in 1925 could leave one's face black with engine oil specks and one's stomach churning from constant vibration and motion. Not surprisingly, air sickness was common. So common, in fact, that some early airlines hired nurses as flight attendants to care for ill or nervous passengers. The world's first flight attendants, introduced by a U.S. airline, Boeing Air Transport, in 1930, were indeed required to be registered nurses for this reason, though that was just after our 1920s time frame. It reflects the atmosphere of early passenger travel. Despite the discomfort and expense, the idea of flight was irresistibly glamorous to a certain clientele, the wealthy and the adventurous. By the late 1920s, flying was becoming a fashionable mode for the elite. One could shave days off a transcontinental trip. For example, in 1928, Germany's Zeppelin airships, again not airplanes but part of aviation history, had inaugurated luxurious transatlantic flights, and in 1931, Australia and England were connected by a continuous air route, though involving multiple hops and aircraft changes. The allure of these feats had captivated the public's imagination and hinted that routine global air travel was on the horizon. Technologically, the late 1920s saw great strides in aircraft design that made airlines more viable. Initially, many passenger planes were modified military types, not ideal for comfort or economics. But soon, companies started designing airliners from scratch. The Fokker Trimeter, like the Fokker F-7, a high-wing plane carrying about 8 passengers, and the German Junkers SF-13, a pioneering all-metal monoplane, first flown in 1919, carrying 4 passengers, set early benchmarks for reliability. Henry Ford even got into the business briefly, building the Ford Trimeter from 1925, which carried 10 passengers and was called the Tin Goose. It was rugged and used on early airline routes in the Americas. Then came the Boeing 80 in 1928, a 3-engine biplane airliner for 18 passengers, and the Bach and Sikorsky flying boats for Pan American's routes over water. Crucially, in 1927, the U.S. Post Office changed its mail payment structure to favor larger aircraft that could carry more weight, including passengers. This led directly to the development of bigger planes and meant airlines had an incentive to fill seats with people, not just sacks of letters. The Air Commerce Act and later amendments also enforced stricter safety regulations, which improved public confidence. By 1929, the aviation industry had matured significantly. There were established airlines on every continent. Imperial Airways in Britain was flying routes from London to parts of the British Empire, a multi-leg journey to India and on to Australia in partnership with Qantas by the 30s. Lufthansa in Germany was active, as was Air France, formed from several smaller French lines in 1933, a bit later. In the U.S., carriers like Pan American Airways had begun operating flying boats to connect America with Latin America and the Caribbean, forging what would become a global network. The number of airline passengers worldwide climbed steadily. It was reported that in the U.S., annual passenger numbers grew from just 6,000 in 1930 to nearly 500,000 by 1934, reflecting how quickly air travel was gaining ground. This growth was aided by the general prosperity and roaring optimism of the late 1920s, before the Great Depression hit. The golden age of aerial, adventure, records, and icons. Parallel to the rise of routine air service, the interwar years were also a golden age of record-setting flights and charismatic aviation icons. In the 1920s and 30s, aviators competed to push the boundaries, faster, higher, farther, often capturing world headlines with their exploits. These feats did not always have immediate practical application, but they stirred the public's imagination and advanced aviation knowledge. The most famous of these was undoubtedly Charles Lindbergh. In May 1927, the 25-year-old U.S. airmail pilot took off alone in a small monoplane, the Spirit of St. Louis, aiming to win the Orteig Prize by flying non-stop from New York to Paris. For 33 hours and 30 minutes, Lindbergh flew through skies that went from clear blue to star-studded night to misty dawn, fighting fatigue in the cramped single-seat cockpit. He navigated mostly by dead reckoning and a compass, skimming low over storm clouds and at times almost dozing off over the featureless Atlantic waves. On the evening of May 21st, 1927, a crowd of 100,000 spectators at Le Bourget Airport in Paris erupted in delirious joy as his lone aircraft appeared and touched down. Lindbergh had done it. He became the first person to fly solo and non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean. The impact was seismic. Instantly, Lindbergh became a global hero, Lucky Lindy, the embodiment of the can-do spirit of the age. His achievement, widely publicized by radio and newspapers, made countless people believe that aviation's future had arrived. In the wake of Lindbergh's flight, interest in flying skyrocketed. Enrollment in flight schools jumped, and applications for pilot licenses in America reportedly quadrupled in the months after. People who had never cared about airplanes suddenly talked about air routes and altitudes. Lindbergh's calm, modest demeanor — he famously slept for a full day after landing, exhausted, and the sheer audacity of his success helped persuade skeptics that airplanes could be safe, long-distance transport. He followed up with a goodwill tour, flying the Spirit of St. Louis to various countries, essentially acting as an ambassador of flight. Close on Lindbergh's heels came Amelia Earhart, another name that has echoed through history. In 1928, Earhart became the first woman to cross the Atlantic by air, as a passenger in a plane named Friendship. But she was not satisfied being a passenger. She honed her skills and set out to break records of her own. In May 1932, 5 years to the day after Lindbergh, she piloted her single-engine Lockheed Vega Solo across the Atlantic, from Newfoundland to a pasture in Northern Ireland, battling icing and mechanical troubles en route. This made Earhart the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, and it cemented her status as Lady Lindy in the press. Tall, poised, and articulate, Amelia Earhart was a champion for women in aviation and an inspiration to many. She set more records. First woman to fly solo coast to coast in the U.S., an altitude record, and others. In 1937, her bold attempt to fly around the world at the equator, something no one had done, ended tragically with her disappearance over the Pacific Ocean. Earhart's loss was mourned internationally. She had come to symbolize the adventurous spirit of the age and the breaking of gender barriers. To this day, her fate remains one of aviation's great, unsolved mysteries. But her legacy as a trailblazer remains undiminished. There were many others. Howard Hughes, a wealthy American and a bit of a maverick, set a speed record flying around the world in 1938 in just 91 hours in a Lockheed Super Electra. His showmanship and later Hollywood connections made him a legend, but also advanced aircraft technology. Wiley Post, a one-eyed Oklahoman pilot, circled the globe solo in 1933 using an autopilot and radio compass, inventions that foreshadowed modern avionics. Post also explored high-altitude flying and discovered the jet stream, donning one of the first pressure suits to soar to 50,000 feet where the thin air required breathing apparatus. Beryl Markham, a British Kenyan aviatrix, became the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic from east to west, England to North America, against the headwinds in 1936, chronicling her bush pilot life in Africa in the poetic memoir West with the Night. Jean Batten of New Zealand broke speed records between England and Australia, earning the title Garbo of the Skies for her reclusive mystique. And groups of military aviators made significant long-distance flights too, such as the U.S. Army Air Service's flight around the world in 1924, using a relay of Douglas World Cruiser biplanes, and the Italian Air Force's transatlantic squadron flights, led by General Italo Balbo in the early 1930s. These feats, reported breathlessly in newspapers and radio, gave the public heroes to look up to and kept aviation in the spotlight. They were analogous to the space race milestones of the 1960s in the awe they generated. Every record broken was proof that airplanes were getting faster, more capable, more reliable. By setting these extreme goals, the pilots and their backers forced technology to improve. Stronger airframes, better engines, refined navigation methods, which all filtered down to everyday aviation. For instance, Lindbergh's solo Atlantic flight showed the value of a lightweight, single-engine plane with long range, influencing military and civil long-range plane designs. Hughes pushed us for all-metal high-performance aircraft. Post's use of autopilot and radio beacon navigation demonstrated how pilots could fly beyond visual landmarks, a critical step towards safe airline operations in bad weather or at night. And the very act of surviving long flights helped develop better understanding of human factors, from fatigue management to nutrition, in flight. As the 1920s turned to the 1930s, the world of aviation had a momentum that felt unstoppable, even amid the economic hardships of the Great Depression. People could list the names of famous pilots the way later generations would list astronauts. Flight had woven itself into the fabric of popular culture. Songs like Come Josephine in My Flying Machine became hits. Movies and newsreels showed daring flyers. children played with model airplanes and dreamed of becoming pilots. Aviation entered language and metaphor. To achieve something great was to take off or soar. And through it all, the aircraft themselves were evolving from the wire and cloth biplanes of World War I to the sleek, all-metal monoplanes that would dominate the late 1930s. The stage was set for the next chapter, one that would see air travel become truly global and airplanes take on an even more decisive role, for better and for worse, as the world moved toward another great conflict. The world in flight, aviation infrastructure, and innovation between the wars. By the 1930s, the rapid progress in aviation demanded a parallel development on the ground, the creation of an infrastructure and institutional framework to support safe and efficient flying. The airplane had outgrown the improvised cow pastures and makeshift systems of the 1910s. To fully realize the potential of air travel and transport, societies needed airports, airways and regulations, and technological aids. This period saw the foundation of many elements of aviation we take for granted today, laid down in a rather calm, methodical way behind the scenes, even as headline-grabbing flights stole the limelight. Building airports and air routes. Early airports were literally fields. The Wrights used a pasture, and barnstormers used any flat stretch they could find. But as scheduled services began, dedicated airfields with amenities emerged. Often these were adapted municipal fields or racetracks at first. In Europe, some of the first true airports included Le Bourget in Paris, which gained fame when Lindbergh landed there in 1927, and Croydon Airport near London, which by the mid-1920s had a proper terminal building, customs facilities, and even a hotel nearby to serve international passengers. These were pioneering airports, gateways for travelers much as seaports had been. In the United States, Cleveland's Municipal Airport, later Hopkins Airport, opened in 1925 as one of the first city-owned airports with established schedules, and it introduced innovations like a radio-equipped control room. Miami, Los Angeles, Chicago, and other cities followed, turning dusty landing strips into graded runways and building hangars and terminals. Notably, the city of Newark, New Jersey, opened a major commercial airport in 1928 with concrete runways, a significant improvement over grass, allowing heavier aircraft to operate reliably. Newark was the primary New York area airport until LaGuardia opened in 1939. These early airports were modest by modern standards. Terminals were often a single room or two. Weather information might be a chalkboard with wind readings, and night operations relied on bonfires or flare pots until electric boundary lights came in. But they had a certain romance. People dressed up to greet arriving flights, and spectators might line fences to watch the graceful low approaches of Fokker trimotors or Ford trimotors bringing in mail and VIPs. The architecture of some terminals, like Croydon's neoclassical building, or later the Art Deco facades of the 1930s, for example, the beautiful terminal at London's Heathrow predecessor in Heston, or Berlin's Tempelhof, reflected society's sense of awe and pride in flight. On a larger scale, airways, structured routes in the sky, took shape, thanks largely to the groundwork of the airmail service. By the late 1920s, the United States had a complete transcontinental airway with lighted beacons every few miles, as described earlier. Pilots followed these blinking lights like a trail of stars across the darkness. Radio navigation began to supplement visual beacons. Low-frequency radio ranges, LFR, were set up, emitting coded signals that pilots could use with onboard receivers to stay on course even in poor visibility. These were primitive by today's standards, requiring the pilot to listen for Morse code A's and N's, dot dash versus dash dot, merging into a steady tone when on the correct line, but they worked. For example, in 1929, a pilot could fly from New York to Chicago, guided by radio range signals nearly the whole way, an immense advancement for all-weather flying. Europe, too, developed air routes, often state-managed. There were aerial lighthouses and radio stations from London to Paris to Berlin. The world's first air traffic control tower is often cited as the one at London Croydon, established in 1920, though their control mostly consisted of waving flags or using lamps to signal pilots. By the 1930s, radio communication allowed ground controllers to talk directly to pilots, giving weather updates or landing instructions. In 1933, in Newark, a man named Archie League is credited as one of the first air traffic controllers in the U.S., originally using flags to direct planes. The profession of air traffic control was born quietly, as airports grew busier and multiple aircraft needed sequencing for takeoffs and landings. A calm voice on the radio, cleared to land, became an unseen but crucial part of flying. Aircraft technology leaps between the wars, the design of airplanes themselves underwent a profound evolution. The open cockpit biplanes of WWI gave way to the streamlined monoplanes of the late 1930s. One key driver was the discovery that all-metal aircraft were superior in performance and durability to wooden fabric construction. Early attempts at metal planes by Hugo Junkers in Germany, like the Junkers F-13 in 1919, paved the way. By the mid-1930s, Douglas in the U.S. and others were producing iconic all-metal airliners. The Douglas DC-3, introduced in 1935, stands out as a marvel of this period. With a sleek aluminum fuselage, two powerful radial engines, seating for 21 passengers, and a speed of around 200 milliters, it revolutionized air travel. For the first time, an airline could make a profit carrying just passengers. Previous planes often needed mail subsidies to make money. The DC-3 was reliable, easy to fly for its time, and could connect city pairs in hours that had taken days by train. It dominated airline fleets worldwide and would continue to fly for decades in various roles. Its development was indirectly a response to an airline need for larger planes to reduce costs, a demand amplified by the tragic 1931 crash of a wooden-wing Fokker Trimeter that killed famous Notre Dame coach Knut Rockne, which turned public opinion against older designs. The DC-3's success symbolized the maturity of aviation. It was no longer experimental. It was everyday transport. Another leap was pressurization. Flying higher meant avoiding weather and going faster due to thinner air, but humans could not breathe up there. The solution, pressurized cabins, arrived with the Boeing 307 Stratoliner in 1940, which could cruise at 20,000 feet in shirt-sleeve comfort. Pan Am and TWA had just begun using Stratoliners when WO2 intervened, but the concept was proven and would be key to the post-war jet age. Navigation technology also improved steadily. By the late 1930s, instrument flying, using cockpit instruments alone without outside visual references, had been mastered, largely thanks to the pioneering work of Jimmy Doolittle in 1929, when he made the first blind landing. That required a gyroscopic attitude indicator, directional gyro, like a compass that doesn't dip or sway, and sensitive altimeter, all of which became standard cockpit instruments, often called the blind flying panel. Radio beacons, as mentioned, allowed routes through clouds, and the addition of weather radar and other aids would come after WHUTWUND, but even before, pilots were learning to trust their instruments and fly in foul weather, making aviation more dependable year-round. International cooperation in aviation also took root. In 1919, even before the end of WWI, the Paris Convention established some early rules of the air, like nations' sovereignty over their airspace. In 1929, an agreement standardized some rules for air travel, like requiring licenses, certificates of airworthiness, etc., and a global time standard, Greenwich time for aviation, was adopted. These were the seeds that would later form the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, after W2. By the end of the 1930s, air travel had an infrastructure not unlike railroads or steamships: timetables, fixed routes, support systems, albeit on a smaller scale. An airline passenger in 1938 could, for instance, depart New York in the morning on a DC-3, hop across the U.S. with a couple of stops, and reach Los Angeles in under 18 hours, unimaginable a generation prior. Or one could board a Pan Am Clipper flying boat in San Francisco and island hop to Hong Kong in a week's leisurely journey, dining on fine china as the seaplane skimmed to landings in Honolulu, Midway, Guam, Manila, and so on. These multi-stop long routes were the precursors to the non-stop flights of today, requiring some patience, but nonetheless forging global links. Aviation had truly knitted the world closer. Borders were no longer barriers from above, and oceans could be conquered with planning and persistence. Yet, on the eve of World War II's, even as the golden age of interwar aviation hit its stride, darker clouds were forming again. The technology of flight, for all the peaceful connectivity it promised, was about to be harnessed once more to the engines of war, on an unprecedented scale. The interwar years had given humanity a tantalizing glimpse of a world made smaller and more wondrous by flight. The coming conflict would show another face of aviation, destructive and decisive, before yielding ultimately to the biggest jet-assisted boom in global air travel the world had ever seen. World War II, Wings of Destruction and Deliverance, 1939 set to 1945. In September 1939, World War II began with the roar of aircraft engines, as well as the tramp of armies. In the 20 years since the last war, aviation had advanced light years. Now, conflict would ignite an explosion of innovation and a massive deployment of air power that far outstripped WWI. The war in the skies from 1939 to 1945 would prove both devastating and transformative, setting the stage for the post-war aviation boom and the jet age. From the first days of Wohudotsudu, aircraft played leading roles in a way never seen before. On September 1st, 1939, as German forces invaded Poland, Luftwaffe dive bombers, Ju-87 Stukas, screamed down to attack Polish targets, heralding the new era of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, where fast-moving tanks on the ground were coordinated with tactical bombers in the air. The shock and awe of those aerial assaults signaled to the world that control of the sky would be crucial in this war. In fact, the Battle of Britain in 1940 was the first major campaign fought almost entirely in the air. After the fall of France, Britain stood alone, and the German Air Force sought to achieve air superiority as a prelude to invasion. In that summer and autumn, the skies over southern England were filled daily with swarming formations of German bombers and their fighter escorts, met by scrambling squadrons of Royal Air Force Hurricanes and the now legendary Spitfires. What unfolded was an epic defensive air battle. British pilots, aided by a groundbreaking new technology, radar, which gave early warning of incoming raids, managed to thwart the Luftwaffe's onslaught. The RAF's victory in the Battle of Britain, Winston Churchill's famous line, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," prevented a German invasion and marked Nazi Germany's first major defeat. It was aviation's finest hour in the public eye. The courage of those young pilots, the resilience of the British people sheltering from the Blitz bombings that followed, and the moral that air power could defend a nation under siege. For the first time, a battle's outcome, and perhaps the war's course, hung on fighter planes and the heroism of their pilots alone. Meanwhile, across the globe, aviation shaped the war in myriad ways. On December 7th, 1941, the world was shocked by the attack on Pearl Harbor. Carrier-launched Japanese warplanes descended on the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, sinking battleships and propelling the United States into the war. This single airstrike demonstrated the strategic reach of naval aviation. The aircraft carrier had superseded the battleship as the decisive weapon at sea. Throughout Wright, carriers and their airplane complements would duel in Pacific waters, from Midway to the Philippine Sea. Airplanes became the long arm of navies, scouting vast ocean areas and delivering punches over the horizon. On land, the Second World War saw the massive use of strategic bombing. Allied planners believed that heavy bombers could strike directly at an enemy's war-making capacity by flattening factories and cities. The war's later years witnessed fleets of hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, American four-engine bombers, streaming across the skies of Europe by day, while at night the drone of countless Lancasters and Halifaxes, British bombers, passed overhead. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, once vibrant urban centers, were reduced to smoking ruins by incendiary and high-explosive bombs raining from high altitudes. The toll in lives was enormous and remains a subject of ethical debate. Strategically, the bombing campaign crippled German industry and broke Japanese capacity, but at immense cost. In the air, bomber crews endured hellish conditions, lack of oxygen in unpressurized cabins at 20,000 feet, extreme cold that could freeze a gun solid, and flak explosions rocking their planes. They also faced the terrifying specter of enemy fighter interceptions. German defenders like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190, or Japan's Nimble Zero fighter, inflicted grievous losses until long-range Allied escort fighters, like the American P-51 Mustang, once fitted with extra tanks, and the twin-engine P-38 Lightning in the Pacific, could accompany the bombers all the way to target and back. The skies were a deadly battlefield in their own right, with life expectancy for new bomber aircrew sometimes measured in just a dozen missions in the harshest periods. Every year of the war accelerated technological progress. Radar, which we noted, was refined for various uses. Night fighters carried airborne radar to find enemies in the dark. Ships had radar to spot aircraft, and even primitive forms of heat-seeking and TV-guided bombs were tested. There were leaps in engine power and reliability. Each new fighter model climbed faster and packed more punch. By 1944, the first operational jet fighters appeared. Germany's Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was capable of speeds over 500 mph, far beyond any propeller plane. Britain had the Gloucester Meteor jets concurrently. These jets came too late to change the war's outcome, but heralded the future. Indeed, the Me 262's smooth, sinister silhouette and blazing speed left an indelible impression on those who encountered it. The war also pushed the boundaries of aircraft size and range. The Americans developed the B-29 Superfortress, a pressurized super bomber with a range that enabled direct strikes on Japan from distant bases. It was a B-29, the Enola Gay, that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima in August 1945, the most devastating single act of aerial warfare ever, effectively bringing the conflict to an end. The image of that lone bomber and its terrible cargo symbolized how absolute the command of air had become, from two brothers skipping over sand dunes to harnessing the fundamental power of the atom and delivering it by air, all in 4 decades. It was both an awe-inspiring and horrifying milestone. On the lighter side, aviation in WW2 was not solely about destruction. Airplanes saved lives too in daring resupply missions and evacuations. One poignant episode was the Berlin airlift of 1948-49, just post-war, but born from the wartime cargo plane innovations, where Allied cargo aircraft supplied a whole city by air alone during a Soviet blockade. That was a direct descendant of wartime efforts like flying the Hump over the Himalayas to supply China, or the airdrops to resistance fighters across Europe. The idea that you could sustain an army or a population purely through an air bridge became feasible thanks to the rugged transport planes developed during Waiutun, like the C-47 Skytrain, the military version of the DC-3s, and the larger C-54 Skymaster. By war's end, American factories, like Ford's Willow Run, were churning out a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at peak, and overall the U.S. produced an astonishing 300,000-plus military aircraft during the war years. Such scale was inconceivable before. It represented a complete mobilization of society to create flying machines. Women also played a critical role in wartime aviation, not usually as combatants, with notable exceptions like the Soviet Union's female combat pilots, the Night Witches, who flew nocturnal harassment bombing missions in biplanes. In the US and UK, female pilots ferried aircraft from factories to air bases. The WASPs in America, Women Air Force Service pilots, and the Air Transport Auxiliary in Britain. These women flew every type of plane, from trainers to heavy bombers, freeing male pilots for combat roles. Though they didn't engage in dogfights, they proved that skill and courage in the cockpit were not limited by gender, and they faced dangers too. Many lost their lives in accidents or to occasional enemy action. Their contribution paved the way for greater acceptance of women in post-war aviation careers. By VJ Day in 1945, the global landscape was utterly changed, including the aerial landscape. Europe and Japan were in ruins largely due to bombing. The age of missiles was dawning. German V-2 rockets were a primitive precursor to guided ballistic missiles and space travel, and the world had witnessed both the most horrific uses of flight for war and some of the most heroic uses of flight for deliverance and exploration. The war had shown that to rule the air was to rule the war. Control of airspace became an essential national objective. No major battle was won without at least temporary air superiority above it, whether it was tanks in North Africa or ships at Midway. It vindicated the early prophets of air power, like Julio Douay and Billy Mitchell, albeit not always exactly in the ways they predicted. When peace came, there was a vast surplus of aircraft, airfields, and trained personnel. The question was, what now? Would all these pilots and planes fade away as after WWI, or could they be converted to peaceful progress? The answer emerged swiftly as the late 1940s and 1950s ushered in an unprecedented boom in civil aviation, using the fruits of wartime innovation to shrink the world in an entirely new way. The hard-won lessons of war, stronger aircraft designs, better navigation, the very invention of the jet engine, would fuel the next chapter in the story of flight. The jet age, when the world truly became connected by airline routes like never before, and when even the sky would no longer be the limit as humans turned their eyes to space. But before reaching the stars, humanity would first span the globe at jet speed, turning that tomorrow that early aviators dreamed of into the accomplishments of today. The jet age, shrinking the world, 1945 to 1960s. In the aftermath of World War II, the world found itself with two things that would ignite the jet age: advanced aviation technology, including the jet engine, and a keen desire for peace and prosperity that would encourage global travel. The late 1940s and 1950s thus saw air transport explode from an elite novelty into a mainstream mode of travel. Jets cut travel times dramatically. New airliners grew in size and comfort, and the far corners of the earth were pulled closer together than ever before. One of the immediate consequences of WW2 was an abundance of skilled pilots and sturdy ex-military aircraft. Many wartime transport planes, like the C-47, Dao-3, were quickly converted for civil airline use, kickstarting the post-war airline industry by providing cheap, reliable planes to carry passengers and cargo. For example, Douglas DC-3s, including those built as C-47s, flooded the market. These legendary planes became the backbone of airlines worldwide through the late 1940s, affectionately remembered for their tail-dragging stance and enduring dependability. If you flew in 1946, chances are you were in a DC-3, hearing its twin engines droning and perhaps feeling the vibration through your seat, but also trusting its well-proven capabilities. The organizational structure for global aviation also took shape swiftly. In 1944, even before the war ended, the Allied nations met in Chicago and laid groundwork for the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, which would set standard rules for airspace, pilot licensing, safety regulations, and so forth. This was an important cooperative step. It meant, for instance, that a plane registered in one country could fly safely in another's skies under agreed rules, and that navigation aids would be standardized. The world was preparing to fly as one system. The real revolution, however, was the arrival of the jet engine in commercial service. The jet engine, unlike piston engines, could propel aircraft faster and higher with smoother power. Developed during the war, Frank Whittle's work in Britain, the German jets like the Me-262, jets promised to cut flight times in half or more. The very first commercial jet airliner to fly was the British de Havilland Comet, which entered service in 1952 with BOAC. The Comet, a sleek aluminum airliner with 4 turbojet engines buried in its wings, was the marvel of its day. It could cruise at 40,000 feet, well above the weather, and fly at 500 motions roughly twice as fast as the propeller-driven airliners it aimed to replace. Passengers were awed by its quiet, no piston thrum, smooth ride, and the ability to get from London to Johannesburg or Singapore in a day with refueling stops, a journey that previously took multiple days and perhaps a ship segment. However, tragically, the early comets suffered mysterious crashes in 1953-54 due to metal fatigue causing catastrophic breakups. This temporarily grounded the promise of jets and was a humbling lesson in the new challenges posed by high-altitude, high-speed flight, leading to deeper understanding of pressurization stress on airframes and the introduction of fail-safe design features. While the British troubles with the Comet were being resolved, a redesigned Comet returned later. The Americans seized the initiative. In 1958, Pan American World Airways launched the first transatlantic jet service using the Boeing 707. The inaugural flight from New York to Paris that October in a gleaming 707 marked the true start of the jet age for the masses. The Boeing 707 and its Douglas competitor DC-8 soon after could carry around 150 passengers at speeds of 600 miles over oceans nonstop. Now New York to London was a 7-hour hop rather than a 15-hour ordeal with refueling stops on a propeller plane or a 3-5-day ship crossing. The world suddenly felt much smaller. Business executives could meet globally. Tourists could consider overseas holidays in a week's time, and families separated by vast distances could contemplate visits that had once been lifetime dreams. Jet travel also had a certain glamour in its early years. Think of the term jet set, coined to describe the cosmopolitan high society who jetted around to glamorous locales. Airlines vied to offer the most luxurious service. Stewardesses, as they were called then, in chic uniforms, catered to passengers with full meals, cocktails, and pampering. The image of the pretty stewardess became an icon of the age, albeit a sexist one by today's lens, with strict requirements on age, weight, and appearance imposed on them at the time. The interiors of early jets often featured lounge areas, generous legroom by modern standards, and large windows. With fewer flights and high ticket costs, early jet tickets were expensive, often akin to a month's wages for an average worker. Those who flew were usually dressed in their best, and airlines marketed flight as a stylish experience. Pan Am, in particular, cultivated an aura of sophistication, being the first to fly many new routes and aircraft. Its blue globe logo became synonymous with international travel. As the 1960s progressed, jets became larger and slightly more economical. Air travel started opening up to the middle class. Wide-body jets arrived in 1970 with the Boeing 747 and its jumbo jet, a behemoth double-decker at the front, capable of carrying over 350 passengers. The 747, with its iconic hump, revolutionized mass travel. It lowered the per-seat costs enough that flying steadily became accessible to millions more. A New York to London ticket price fell in real terms year after year, especially as competition arose. Now the global mobility we know today, students backpacking in foreign countries, widespread international tourism, families emigrating and returning to visit, really took off. Back in the 1950s and 60s, aside from the jets, another kind of speed tantalized the world: supersonic flight. To fly faster than sound, about 760 meters at altitude, promised to shrink the world even further, perhaps New York to London in 3 hours. This dream led to the Concorde, an Anglo-French project, and the Soviet Tupolev Tu-144. The Concorde, with its elegant delta wing and drooping nose, first flew in 1969 and entered passenger service in 1976. It was a technological marvel, cruising at Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, at stratospheric heights where you could see the curvature of the Earth. Concorde cut travel times across the Atlantic to 3.5 hours. One could depart London at 10 a.m. and arrive New York at 8 a.m. local time, earlier the same day. It was the epitome of luxury and speed, but its extremely high costs and limited seating meant it remained a niche, product for the wealthy and for prestige, never reshaping mass travel. Still, it captured the imagination as the pinnacle of what passenger aviation could achieve. That sonic boom as it passed overhead was the sound of future knocking, though tellingly, concerns about sonic booms prevented supersonic jets from overflying land at speed, curbing their use. But the mainstream story was the democratization of air travel. By the late 1960s, annual world airline passengers numbered in the tens of millions and climbing exponentially. The invention of the jet airliner is often cited as one of the greatest contributors to globalization. Suddenly, crossing oceans was routine. Cultures that had been distant could mingle. Economic ties and international business flourished on the back of speedy travel. Borders blurred as people and ideas jetted around with unprecedented ease. A family from India could relocate to Canada and know they were a day's flight from home, not a month's sea voyage. Fresh produce and cut flowers could be flown from one hemisphere to another. The first shipments of fresh jet-flown strawberries from California to New York, or winter roses from South America to Europe, were small wonders of the jet age supply chains. Even the concept of time zones took on new significance. Jet lag became a common word, describing the disorienting effect of jumping across time so fast. With the boom also came some sobering lessons in safety and complexity. As skies grew busier, the need for rigorous air traffic control and navigation systems increased. Mid-air collisions, though rare, did occur and spurred improvements, such as the introduction of the transponder and radar air traffic control, so controllers could see and identify flight numbers on their radar scopes. And eventually, the TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System, in cockpits decades later. One tragic crash over the Grand Canyon in 1956 between two airliners led directly to the modernization and federalization of U.S. air traffic control. The highly choreographed ballet of thousands of jets crisscrossing daily required and got vast infrastructure, radar installations, control towers, en route control centers, international agreements on altitudes and routes, and meteorological services providing swift updates. Airline safety actually improved vastly in the jet era, contrary to what one might assume with faster planes. Jets were more reliable mechanically than piston engines that had so many moving parts and potential points of failure. Redundancy, multiple engines, systems backups became standard in design. The 1960s saw the introduction of the black box flight recorders to investigate accidents and thus prevent future ones. By the end of the 20th century, despite a huge increase in flights, flying had become one of the safest forms of transport per mile. The calm professionalism of pilots and controllers largely kept it that way. For passengers, however, early, jets did have some quirks. Cabins were noisy due to older jet engine designs, and not as pressurized as today, so ears popped mightily. Smoking was allowed on board. Indeed, in the 60s, It was common to light a cigarette mid-flight, resulting in a distinctive stale odor in cabins. Turbulence on a fast jet could be jarring, but the introduction of weather radar in cockpits helped pilots avoid many rough storms. As the 1960s closed, humanity took one more giant leap that owed its momentum to the progress in aviation, spaceflight. It's worth noting how intimately connected the space age was to aviation. In fact, early astronauts were mostly military test pilots. The very term astronaut means star sailor and cosmonaut, cosmos sailor, but they were essentially pilots of spacecraft. The line from Kitty Hawk leads to Cape Canaveral. The Wright's success inspired the generations of engineers, including rocketeers like Robert Goddard, who had been working on rockets since the 1920s, and Werner von Braun. The development of pressurized cabins and high-altitude flight research was crucial for designing spacecraft, and many of the techniques for navigation and control in space were first tested in high-speed aircraft. In 1969, Neil Armstrong, a former X-15 test pilot and naval aviator, became the first human to walk on the moon, famously noting one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. He carried a few small pieces of the Wright Flyer's wood and fabric with him to the moon, a symbolic gesture linking the very first powered flight to that transcendental moment on another world. Only 66 years had passed between Kitty Hawk and Apollo 11, a fact that even today boggles the mind. In one lifetime, humanity went from barely lifting off the ground to voyaging through space. Truly, tomorrow had heralded the unbelievable, just as Percy Fansler said in 1914, "Flight in culture and imagination, the ever-inspiring sky." From the beginning, flight has captured not just the practical mind of inventors and politicians, but the artistic and spiritual imagination of humanity. The 20th century's breakthroughs in aviation resonated deeply in culture, inspiring art, literature, music, and a new perspective on our world. In the early days, as the airplane was proving itself, artists and writers were mesmerized by the new bird's-eye view. Suddenly, one could see the world as a map, like the gods looking down from Mount Olympus. This aerial perspective influenced painters like Robert Delaunay, whose 1922 painting Vue du Tour Eiffel depicted the Eiffel Tower and Paris's Champ de Mars from above, a direct reference to the novel sights granted by flight. The Italian futurists went further. They formed the movement of aeropittura, aero painting, in the 1920s, celebrating speed, modernity, and the sensation of flight. Tullio Crowley's painting, Nosediving on the City, 1939, is a striking example showing a surreal, dynamic view as if a plane were hurtling down upon an urban landscape. Futurists saw flight as breaking free from gravity-bound tradition. They wrote manifestos extolling the cleansing violence and beauty of aerial perspective, though as noted, some of their rhetoric merged with nationalist fervor and later looked sinister once the bombs fell for real. Photography and cinematography also embraced the aerial view. As early as WWI, pilots like Britain's Richard Carline sketched battlefields from the cockpit, and those sketches translated into new kinds of wartime art. Post-war aerial photography let people for the first time see their own cities and landscapes from above, changing city planning. Le Corbusier famously overflew cities and concluded that many old quarters must be torn down and rebuilt in organized blocks when viewed from the air, and even abstract art, Casimir Malevich and others flirted with geometric abstraction inspired by looking down on Earth's patchwork. In literature, pilots turned authors produced some of the most poetic tributes to flight. The French aviator Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, whom we met earlier as a pioneering airmail pilot in the 1930s, wrote memoirs like Wind, Sand, and Stars, Terre des Hommes, 1939, that contain luminous reflections on flying. In one passage, he describes flying over clouds at night, seeing the world below as a silent moonlit expanse, and muses on the isolation and connection he feels. Clouds became in my mind the frontier between the real and the unreal, between the known and the unknowable. He suggested that a pilot's craft enabled a new kind of contemplation and self-discovery. Saint-Exupéry's beloved novella, The Little Prince, 1943, begins with a pilot crash landing in the Sahara, a scenario he himself survived in 1935, and through the prince's fantastical journey from asteroid to asteroid, one senses the influences of an aviator's cosmic perspective and the loneliness of flying across empty spaces. To him, flying was not just a physical act, but a philosophical one. Beryl Markham, the British Kenyan aviatrix, also wrote beautifully about her bush piloting days in Africa, in West with the Night, 1942, capturing the wonder of night flights and the African landscapes from above. Even Ernest Hemingway praised her prose. Other pilot authors include Richard Bach, whose allegorical Jonathan Livingston Seagull, 1970, and the memoir Biplane celebrate flight as a metaphor for freedom and self-transcendence. Poetry, too, embraced flight. Take John Gillespie Meiji Jr.'s poem, High Flight, 1941, penned by a young Spitfire pilot. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. It's practically a prayer of exultation for the act of flying, often quoted by aviators. Ronald Reagan even quoted from it in the aftermath of the Challenger space shuttle disaster. Meiji wrote of joining the tumbling clouds and touching the face of God, conveying that almost spiritual ecstasy pilots often reported on clear dawn patrols or solitary high flights. Of course, not all cultural reflections were positive or awestruck. H.G. Wells, before planes even flew, imagined aerial warfare in his novel The War in the Air, 1908, a rather grim prophecy of cities bombed from zeppelins and the collapse of civilization. That was a cautionary tale that proved eerily prescient by the mid-20th century. After W2, as the world reckoned with the destruction wrought by bombers, some art took a sobering tone. Picasso's Guernica, 1937, though about a Spanish Civil War bombing by aircraft, became a universal anti-war symbol, emphasizing the terror from above. On the lighter side, flight became part of popular entertainment and dreams. Think of early Hollywood. The first ever Oscar for Best Picture in 1927 went to Wings, a silent film about WWI fighter pilots. It featured thrilling aerial dogfight scenes shot with real planes, dazzling audiences who'd never seen such perspectives. As the decades went on, countless movies from the spirit of St. Louis, dramatizing Lindbergh's feat, to Top Gun energizing a 1980s generation with jet fighter glamour, kept aviation in the public eye. In the 1950s and 60s, as commercial flying boomed, playful songs like Come Fly With Me by Frank Sinatra captured the new chic of airline travel. Airport departure lounges themselves became symbols of cosmopolitan modern life. See the set designs of some mid-century films with their observation decks and stylish crowds waving goodbye. The aesthetics of flight influenced design and architecture. Streamlined modern styles, sweeping curves reminiscent of wings or propeller blades, adorned everything from automobiles to toasters. Air travel's speed and modernity were selling points for consumer goods and advertising. One can find countless retro ads comparing a product to a jet, or using aviation motifs to suggest it's the latest and greatest. The TWA Flight Center at JFK Airport opened in 1962 and designed by Eero Saarinen is an architectural love letter to flight, with its swooping rooflines evoking a bird or wing in motion. It sought to capture the drama and excitement of the jet age for travelers stepping into it. Even language absorbed aviation. We speak of ideas taking flight, of projects getting off the ground, of people flying high with success. The term air-minded was used in the 1930s to describe people enthusiastic about aviation's possibilities. And the darker terms entered too: bombshell, nosedive, air raid, etc., all took on their modern meaning via airplane context. By giving humanity the vantage point of the gods, aviation subtly shifted our philosophical outlook. The sight of Earth from above, especially once the space age gave us photos of our blue planet, nurtured a sense of global unity and fragility. In 1968, the Apollo 8 astronauts, who were essentially doing the ultimate flight around the moon, took the famous Earthrise photo, showing our planet rising above the moon's horizon. Though a product of rocketry, that iconic image's lineage traces back to that first crude photo an airman snapped from his biplane over the trenches, revealing what ground-bound humans couldn't easily see. Many have noted that the ability to fly helped diminish the parochialism of earlier eras. Once you see that rivers and borders are just lines on a map, and from altitude cities look more alike than different, maybe it's a bit harder to demonize neighbors. At the same time, flight reawakened ancient myths and longings. The figure of Icarus from Greek mythology, who flew too close to the sun with waxen wings, was often invoked. Painters and poets used Icarus as a symbol for aviators, sometimes celebratory, sometimes tragic. After WWI, a poet described flyers as young Icarus with wings of burning gold, capturing both their brilliance and their often doomed youth. When Apollo astronauts literally touched the sun, or rather left Earth for the heavens, it was a triumphant inversion of Icarus's fall, human ingenuity succeeding where mythic hubris failed. Finally, the emotional impact on the common person. For centuries, humans looked at birds and clouds and felt a mixture of envy and wonder. To fly was to be free, to transcend the everyday. When at last we flew, everyday people could experience that dream directly. The window seat of an airliner offers a quiet moment of magic. You gaze at the patchwork of fields, the snaking rivers, the cottony cloud blankets, and perhaps realize how connected and yet how small we all are on this planet. Many have described their first flight in reverent terms: the miracle of seeing one's hometown fade below, or the sun setting over a sea of clouds. Even in the era of routine mass air travel, there is often spontaneous applause when a plane lands safely on distant soil, as if acknowledging that what just happened, hurtling through the sky at hundreds of miles an hour, is, in the grand scheme, still pretty miraculous. A century and more of flight, legacy, and reflections Looking back from our vantage point in the 21st century, it's astounding how much the Wright's first flight has changed the world. In just a few generations, aviation has rewoven the fabric of society, in war, in peace, in how we live and think. The practical impact is obvious. What once took weeks by ship now takes hours by plane. The flow of people is in the millions each day. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, on any given day, around 200,000 airplanes took off and landed worldwide, carrying several million passengers. This according to air traffic reports. Airports have become like new city squares, hubs of commerce and culture where the world literally meets. Migration patterns have been profoundly affected. Large diasporas can maintain ties with home via a quick flight. Businesses operate in multiple continents with ease. Tourism has become a global industry, fostering understanding and sometimes tensions between cultures. Even diplomacy changed. Face-to-face summits of world leaders became feasible at short notice, fundamentally altering international relations. Borders have in some ways been softened by aviation. While crossing a land border might involve multiple checkpoints, flying often feels like you've transcended the usual barriers, though airports themselves have their strict customs controls. Symbolically, overflight rights, the permission for airlines to cross countries, became a matter of international diplomacy. Countries realized their sovereignty extended upward to a point, but that sky routes had to be shared. This necessitated unprecedented cooperation through ICAO and bilateral air agreements, forging a more interconnected global regulatory regime than nearly any other human activity. In that sense, the need to manage the skies peacefully pushed nations toward dialogue even during tense periods. The Open Skies treaties and such had political ramifications, building trust. On the other hand, aviation also made war more global and devastating. World War II demonstrated that oceans would no longer shield nations from each other. Air power meant even distant enemies could strike. Since then, the concept of total security behind one's lines vanished. The Cold War's nuclear deterrence was largely an air and later missile deterrence. The phrase long-range bomber entered lexicon with a mix of fear and respect. One could say flight annihilated distance, not only for friendship, but also for enmity. But it also helped avoid direct conflict. The terrifying prospect of nuclear-armed bombers and missiles perhaps enforced a cold peace. The economic impact has been profound. Aviation is a huge industry supporting tens of millions of jobs, from the obvious pilots, flight crew, air traffic controllers, to aircraft manufacturing workers, airport staff, tourism operators, freight logistics personnel, and beyond. Entire cities have grown around airports. Consider how Dubai or Atlanta owe much of their growth to becoming air hubs. Some remote regions leaped into modernity through air links without ever having extensive road or rail networks. Small island nations or landlocked developing countries rely on air for medical access, education travel, and trade of high-value goods. The speed of cargo jets means businesses can have just-in-time supply chains globally integrated. Fresh salmon from Norway in a Tokyo sushi bar within 24 hours of catch, or an emergency medical transplant organ flown across states to save a life within hours. Perishable goods and high-tech components alike zip through skies in the bellies of airliners or dedicated freighters, fueling globalizations of trade. There is also an environmental angle. Flight allowed humans to see Earth as a whole, which partly seeded the environmental movement. The view of Earth from Apollo 8, as mentioned, made many realize the planet's fragility. Yet ironically, aviation also contributes to environmental challenges, specifically climate change due to carbon emissions at high altitudes and other pollutants. As of the mid-2020s, the aviation industry produces roughly 2 to 3% of global CO2 emissions. A single long-haul flight can equal a car's yearly carbon output. This has prompted research into sustainable aviation fuels and more efficient planes, as well as some guilt among travelers. The concept of flight shame emerged in recent years. It's a modern paradox, the freedom to fly anywhere versus the responsibility to preserve the planet. In the realm of imagination, the legacy is deeply personal. Airplanes have become almost mundane. We complain of cramped seats and security lines. Yet ask any child looking up at a contrail streaking the sky, and you'll find the old wonder lives on. Many a young person has stood at an airport fence, watching a roaring jet take off, and felt that spark. I want to do that. Thus, the lineage of dreamers continues. The test pilots of the supersonic age, the astronauts of the space age, all often cite a childhood fascination with airplanes. And as new challenges loom, like possibly humans flying to Mars or developing hypersonic airliners, it's essentially that same human drive to go faster, higher, farther that propelled the Wrights. The human stories are innumerable. The immigrants who could reunite with families thanks to a day's flight instead of a month at sea, the pilgrim who could visit a holy site oceans away, the student from a small village who could attend a university abroad and return with knowledge, the lovers separated by continents who closed the gap. Flight made such arcs possible in one lifetime, where before they might have been impossible or exceedingly rare. In a reflective sense, flying has taught us something about the human condition, that we are both clever and fallible, bold and fragile. We mastered the air, but we also used it to wage terrible war. We built ever more powerful machines, but also saw how those machines can be vulnerable, as in the tragedies of accidents or their environmental toll. We realized our planet is small when you can circle it in a day, which perhaps fosters empathy. Earth is the pale blue dot, seen from afar, as Carl Sagan would say, inhabited by humans who share the same fate. Standing at Kitty Hawk today, at the Wright Brothers National Memorial, one can gaze over the dunes and imagine that first flight. A visitor might reflect that from that sandy takeoff spot, a line of progress extends through time and space to the crowded skies above with their jet contrails, and even further to the International Space Station glinting against the night, all products of humanity's longing to soar. In the quiet coastal wind, one might even hear echoes of Wilbur Wright's laughter and that sputtering engine from 1903, and marvel at how it grew into the colossal industry and inspiration that is aviation. After the Wright brothers' first flight, the world truly learned to fly, not just literally, but metaphorically. We took the gift of those 12 seconds and transformed society with it. The journey from wooden biplanes to supersonic airliners and space rockets has been turbulent, exhilarating, and profoundly consequential. As we drift into a calm night's reflection, we might ponder that each time a plane lifts off a runway, Whether it's a giant 747 carrying pilgrims to Mecca or a tiny Cessna carrying a student on their first solo, it is a small miracle, a testament to creative ingenuity and daring. The sky, once a barrier, became a highway and a home. And though we have now flown farther and faster than the Wrights could have imagined, the spirit of their endeavor, innovation, courage, and the eternal dream of flight continues to guide us as we chart whatever new horizons lie ahead, high above the sleeping world. The gentle roar of an aircraft fades into the distance, and we close our eyes knowing the story of flight, from Kitty Hawk's dunes to the boundless skies, will continue to inspire as long as humans look up and wonder.